I thought I thought it'd be fun if we took a break from Hebrews and just looked at a couple things for Christmas, a closer look at Christmas. And before we go on, I thought it'd be funny to ask a question. You know, was there snow in Israel when Jesus was born? What do you guys think? No? Who thinks no? Most of you guys. This is actually a trick question. Mount Hermon is the highest point in Israel, and it can get snow year-round. So, told ya. That was funny. I am hysterical. You have no idea. Keep myself up at night sometimes. Crazy wakes up and she's like, Michael, be quiet. And I'm like, I'm laughing at my jokes. You just gotta give me a minute here. You know, to end the debate, yes, Mary knew. You know the song, Mary, did you know? Yeah, she knew. An angel told her. You gotta imagine how hard it must have been for Mary. She's got 3 wise guys that come and bring a bunch of things that you can't really use for a child, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. How about diapers and whatnot? And then she finally gets baby Jesus to take a nap, and a drummer boy comes in and wakes him up. Thanks for that. Gee whiz. And then she's got people asking her, "Hey, Mary, did you know?" Yeah, I know. So, the first little thing about Christmas that we're going to look at is, why do people say Xmas? I know a lot of people have a lot of different feelings about it. Some people think it's like some kind of a coordinated attack on Christmas. Some people think it is just another way to take Christmas out of the holiday. Some people just have no idea, and some people just don't care. So I hope that this answer will help you understand kind of the history of it. I really don't care whether people say Xmas or not. I just have that zero opinion. Like, if you have an opinion on it, great for you. I just don't care. So I hope that this helps you just learn history behind it. The early church is very crazy when you study a lot of the things that the early church did that the modern church does not do. One thing was, the early church didn't really celebrate birthdays at all. Part of this was because a lot of the righteous people of the Bible cursed the day of their birth, like Job, for instance. So I think Jeremiah does, and Jonah might have. There's just a lot of people throughout the Bible who cursed the day of their birth. And Christians didn't really give birthdays much concern. They kind of thought, oh, that's what the pagans do. Who cares what they do? What they did celebrate, though, was they celebrated the date of a person's martyrdom. They would see that as their true birthday because they went into heaven. So they kept record of that. But they didn't really care too much about birthdays. It has been brought up by a lot of different popular media nowadays that Christmas was basically invented to overshadow some pagan festivals. That's not absolutely for certain. That is a possible idea, but it's far from conclusive. So if you ever hear atheists say it was Christmas was invented because they were just trying to overshadow the pagan festival, possible. That's possible, but maybe don't claim absolutely something that there's just a little bit of evidence for. We actually don't know when Christmas really got going. It seems like maybe in somewhere in the 200s AD, maybe. But that's kind of maybe. So what happened is, when the church first got going, they largely were not really distinguishable from the Jews. And as far as Rome was concerned, Christianity was a sect of Judaism. So they kind of just left them alone for the first couple of years, because they were just like, okay, Jews had like their own special role where they didn't have to worship the emperor, and in return, they wouldn't rebel against Rome. It was kind of like a ceasefire. Like, we'll leave you alone to do your whole one God thing. Just let us rule you. Don't make us keep coming down there and fighting you. It didn't work. They ended up destroying Israel anyways in 70 AD, so it wasn't really like that great of a plan. But so when it first got going, a lot of Christianity was unsure of, what do we do with these Jewish festivals? Are we Jewish or not? And so they kind of did it, but gradually that kind of stopped. And a lot of Jews had this idea that Christians needed to become Jewish in order to be Christian, so that they needed to keep up the Jewish celebrations. And surprise, surprise, that didn't go over very well. Paul mentions numerous times about different festivals as far as the Jews are concerned, and how it really doesn't affect us too much. And Acts mentions the same thing. We don't have to do Jewish celebrations. And so there got to be this kind of rift between Jews and Christians, and it got kind of wider and wider. And even the Passover, which was like the Jewish big one, the big celebration, even that was outdone by a Christian event. Does anybody know what the Christians substituted Passover for? No, but that was a good one. That was a good guess. Instead of doing Passover, they did this. Nobody? Communion. Communion takes the place of the Passover. And much to my surprise, a couple years back, I found out that it doesn't actually say to do it every time that you meet together. It just says that so often as you do it in remembrance of me. Which I always heard it growing up that you were supposed to do it like every time, and that's not what it says at all. So a little something you can stick in your back pocket for a rainy day, I guess. And so the festivals kind of just took the back seat to where Christians didn't really have festivals. Now, it is true that when Constantine made the whole imperial church thing, he did try to make everything a little bit more, you had to be a Christian. And so there was a lot of paganism that got into the church because they converted to Christianity to kind of make him happy, so he'd leave them alone, because it was like the law. And so that is true, but we really just don't know where Christmas came from. But when it did come, that time that it came when it came, it was called Christ's Mass, Mass of Christ, Christus Mesa in the old English, and this is where Xmas really comes from, because in Greek, Christ is spelt Christos, which begins. If you look here on this deal here, this is the transliteration of the Greek Christos, which looks like it starts with the English X. It's actually the Greek letter chi. Chi, rho, iota, sigma, tau, omicron, sigma. So this is what it would look like hypothetically if you wrote it in English, but in English it's just Christ, so there's no reason for that. And so although it looks like Xmas is actually Christmas, just shortened version. So Xmas is actually Christmas. It's the same thing. That's actually where it came from. So it's not actually a ploy to get rid of Christ from Christmas. And even if it was, it's a very poor attempt, because you're still using the same name. And it's a shortened version of that. So, and then there's Happy Holidays, which is funny, because I've heard a lot of people get angry about the use of Happy Holidays. Holiday literally means holy day. So you're saying happy holy days. It's not removing anything from it. And if you look at, for instance, the Advent calendar, this isn't a day, it's a series of days, so it makes sense to say happy holidays. And then when you get to actually Christmas, Merry Christmas, it makes sense. So I don't really think that there's anything wrong or morally, ambiguous there. I always have the philosophy that it's more important that Christ is in us than in the word Christmas. That's always my go-to. We're supposed to be that to the world. So that takes us to the second fun little thing I want to look at tonight, and that's, what did the nativity scene actually look like? Most of you guys have something like this, and you're very familiar with the story. They go to the inn, and the innkeeper says, "There's no room at the inn." I mean, it's become a pastime, a common joke, right? But it actually didn't really look like that the night that Jesus was born. It might surprise you that there was no inn. There was no innkeeper. And there's not a stable like this. Okay, there was a stable, but it didn't look like this. This is how we build stables. That's not how the Jewish people had stables. So if you look at the accounts, and we're going to actually do that right now, the account of Jesus' birth is surprisingly limited. We have 4 Gospels, and only 2 of them say anything about his birth. So we got a limited pool of information. But then, to make things more complicated, you've got Matthew, which doesn't even really tell us what happened the night of his birth, and Luke, who only tells us what happens the night of his birth. So you got like a little bit of a, well, what do we do with this? So let's turn over. If you go to Matthew, and I purposely did not put it on the screen. If you look over in Matthew, Matthew starts with this genealogy. Now, a conversation for another day that I'm just telling you so you are aware of it. The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew is different from the one in Luke. I'm telling you that now. You can go and study it and try and figure it out your own is hopefully what I'm hoping. And then it goes straight from that to talking about Joseph being told that Mary is pregnant from the Holy Spirit. Does not even mention Mary's whole visit with the angel or anything. Then after that, he hops straight in chapter 2 to 2 years later when wise men come. Nothing about really the night that it happened. If you look at the end of chapter 1, verse 24, when Joseph woke up, he did as the Lord's angel had commanded him. He married her, but did not have sexual relations with her until she gave birth to a son, and he named him Jesus. That's it. That's Matthew's birth account of Jesus. Really not a whole lot to go on. And then, hops 2 years later and explains why they ran off to Egypt and all that. But, that happened years after the fact. So if you go to Luke, once again, if you look at Mark and John, neither of them say anything about the birth of Christ. Mark just picks up and says, John came saying, hey, prepare the way for the Lord, and then here's Jesus, and he's already there. He's already there. John goes back all the way to the pre-incarnate Christ, like the beginning of dawn of time stuff. He goes way back and shows Jesus as the Ancient of Days. Totally different. Luke is the only one that makes an effort to establish what happened the night of Jesus' birth. And he starts off talking about really John's parents, not Jesus' parents, John's parents, and what's happening there. And then he goes and tells the story about how Mary, in chapter 1, verse 26, about how Mary was visited by an angel. And then Mary goes and visits Elizabeth, which you think, what is happening here? And then Mary has her whole song. John's married, and then you hop over and you have Zechariah giving a prophecy. This is before Jesus is even born. And then you get to chapter 2, and you actually see Jesus born. So the night of Jesus' birth, we have one gospel telling us what happened the night of Jesus' birth. 1 out of 4. And this is what it says. It says, starting in chapter 2, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire should be registered. This first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Now, some of you might have heard something about the way that there's a chronological mistake here with the whole Quirinius. I'm not really going to look at that tonight. I just want to say that there's multiple ways to translate that Greek sentence. But long story short, no, this does not contradict the official Roman records that we have. Moving on. So everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Okay. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him tightly in cloth and laid him in a manger. Okay, there's that. Because there was no guest room available for them. Okay, some of your translations will say because there was no room at the inn or something like that. Something along the lines, somewhere in that. Here's the thing about Greek, okay? And I've said this a couple of times. Greek words do have many possible translations. That's absolutely true. The question you have to ask yourself is there any justification in this passage to translate it as in? And the answer is no. No, there's not. There's nothing here in this translation that would make you translate it as in. When this same word is used throughout the Gospels, I should say later on in Luke, it is used when Jesus tells his disciples. He says, "Okay, we're getting ready for the Passover. This is going to be my last night with you. So I want you to go into town, and you're going to find this guy. He's going to let us use his guest room. It's the same word there. He's going to let us use his guest room. And every translator knows that it's guest room. Nobody even makes the argument to translate as inn. So why on earth is it being translated as inn here? It doesn't make sense culturally, and it doesn't make sense archaeologically. And I'm going to go a little bit, explain that a little bit, okay? First off, I'll look at it archaeologically. Bethlehem, thank God for archaeology, because it really showed us a lot of amazing things. Bethlehem was a very small place. Very small place. This is not somewhere that had like Hilton Inn hotels on every corner. I mean, very small place. Actually, there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever that there even was a single inn in Bethlehem. Nothing. This was a small community. They didn't have an inn. If you were going to go somewhere and spend the night, you would have gone to Jerusalem. It was just a couple miles away. That's the first thing. And Bethlehem wouldn't have had anywhere. There's zero evidence for an inn, especially at this time period. So that takes us to a little bit of a cultural issue, which we don't think much about because we don't really work like this. Well, I guess before I get there, I should say this. Really, even the rise of hotels in America has really only gotten to where it is in the past 100 years. Before that, we really didn't have, hotels on every corner. I mean, it was just it was hit or miss. You drive from here to California, and whenever you found a hotel is whenever you'd stop. And things have changed drastically in the last 150 years, but, I mean, that doesn't mean that in Jesus' time they had hotels on every street corner. So then that takes us to the cultural issue, and that's this. It would have been very, very odd, extremely odd, in that culture to go to your hometown and not stay with your family. Families were like this back then. If you went to your hometown and did not stay with your family, that'd just be really weird. That wouldn't really have happened. That's kind of like a big no-no. It's kind of like putting a shame on your household. Why would you do that? We don't think much about it because we think, I'm going to go visit my parents, but I'm getting a hotel room. Because that's how we think in America. But back then, in their culture, they wouldn't have done that kind of thing at all. And so when we look at the archaeology and the culture, and then we look at the translation and say, why would you translate this as guest room available as an inn available? Why would you do that? The answer is there is no reason. And I'll explain why it happened in just a minute, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Also important to notice is that in our head we have this idea they come into town and she's on the back of a donkey or a camel, either or, whichever one's in your head, and as they're getting into town she's going into labor. And so they try to hurry up and find a place. It does not say that, actually. If you look what it just says, while they were there. So they'd gotten there, they were set up shop, they were hanging out. And then while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. So they were already there, staying with their family. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him tightly in cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no guest room available. They're explaining it. They're not explaining that they got into town and went straight to the inn because she was in labor. She was already there at the house with the family. And then she had to use that space because there was no other space in the house. That makes a lot more sense translating-wise. And thank God that the CSB was able to look past tradition to get in there. But there's more. Let's see what else. Okay, so if you go to the next picture here, this is what what the houses looked like back then. In this time, in the first century, this is what a lower class Jewish household looked like back then. You can see that they have an upper and a lower, and at nighttime they would take their animals and they would bring it into the lower section, which sounds gross to us, but once again, that's not our culture. And so then in the morning they'd bring them out. And the rooms would also have multi-purpose function. Okay, so the guest space that they're talking about is up here at the top. Okay, there was no space up there, which makes sense because all the family was together for the census. So they all came into town and they were staying with one another because that's what they would have done back then. As an ancient Near Eastern family, they would have been staying together at the same place. So there was no space there because it was already filled with all the other family members. So she went down here to the manger and to the animal section and laid him in a manger to get away from the people. She probably went into labor down there too. Get away from me, you freaks! Leave me alone. You know, I haven't ever seen a woman that was like, yeah, go ahead and just call everybody in. You know, I'm going into labor. Come on in. You know, I have never seen that. I mean, maybe out there hypothetically, but I've never seen it. So they brought Mary there to deliver, and chances are she had a number of people with her to deliver the baby, because that's how they would have done it in the ancient Near Eastern world. A woman wouldn't have given birth by herself. There were likely numerous women from the family who went down there with her and were doing that, and Joseph was probably not there with her, because once again, that's how they did things back then in that space of the world. So the question is, why, oh why, do any of the Bible translations translate it as in? That's the real question. If there's no warrant for it, why does it happen? And this is where we stumble upon a golden calf. See, way back in 1611, 400 years ago, something really, really important happened. The King James Version. It was super important. It was not the first English translation, but it was the first one that really was widely spread and accepted. And it was a very important one. It was very important for its time. The problem is that it's 400 years old. That's the problem. In 400 more years, this one that I'm holding is going to be obsolete too. That's what happens with translations. Languages adapt, and you have to come up with a new translation. King James hit its peak probably about 200 years ago. It's probably time that we start relooking at the things that it translated. And so there's a big push among translators to try and keep traditional wording as much as possible. It's a really big push. Hey, don't, if you can try to sound like the King James, sound like the King James. And a huge push, and there's this whole tradition that goes along with it, especially on certain highlighted verses. So these highlighted verses would include like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, right? Everybody knows that. You try to make it as close to the King James as you can, so that people don't, you want to stick with the good thing. Another good example is, even though there is no warrant for it whatsoever, in Genesis, it said, when it's talking about the flood, the King James said that it was a global flood that flooded the whole world. People didn't think like that back then. They didn't think in terms of global. A much better translation, which every other time that word appears in Genesis, it's translated like this: the whole land, the whole area. The only space in the whole account that it ever even says the word world is in regards to the flood. Now, why do they do that? Because the King James translated it like that, and now there's a whole political thing to it. Because if we don't translate it as the flood was over the whole world, we aren't really standing on the Word of God. So now there's this whole political thing, and now people are divided among, was it a global flood or was it a local flood? And it's like, anyways, the correct translation of the word is the whole area or the whole land. Now, whether that whole land includes the whole world or not, that's a whole other discussion. What we are trying to do is get away from the politics and get into what actually is a warranted translation. So there's just two examples of how the King James people try to stick with it even where it doesn't make sense. And so then here we have the exact same thing. People go within a lot of times, even though there's no justification, because tradition rules. It's an unfortunate reality, but there it is. So what we have is Mary is there for the census with the family. She goes into labor, and then she goes down here in the bottom section of the house to get away from people, which makes sense. If you read this story, it never once says anything about the innkeeper, which I know in most nativity scenes that you see kids playing out and stuff, there's always an innkeeper, and they go to the innkeeper, and he says, there's no room at the inn. There is no innkeeper. There's no... And remember, if we look at the Greek without any of our American mindset with it, there's really no mention of an inn either. There's a mention of a guest room, which makes sense archaeologically. So, I hope that makes sense. And the main idea of the nativity, I think, is what people miss because they like this so much. And that's this. Jesus came that we might have life. That's the highlight of the nativity. That's the main focus. And no, there were not 3 wise men on the night that Jesus was born. That wasn't a thing. There were shepherds, yes. There were a lot of family, yes. and it was probably stinky. Yes, yes. So then that takes us to the last thing I want to look at. What was the order of events? Because when we know that there were some things that happened, but we're not quite sure how it all fits together. And so it looks like to a lot of people there's a contradiction here somewhere. I'm not sure where it is, but there's a contradiction. And if you actually read the accounts, there is no contradiction. You just have to realize that they're talking about different things. Matthew, for instance, is talking more to a Jewish audience, and he wants to talk about the way that Jesus is a Jew and that he's the King of Kings. Luke, that's not his concern. Okay? Luke's concern is more trying to show the poor. He's trying to show the way that the Holy Spirit moved during that time, especially if you read Luke and Acts together. And he's trying to show the way that Jesus cares for the down and out. For instance, if you look at the Pharisees in the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees are mostly shown in a negative light. But if you read in the Gospel of Luke, the Pharisees are shown in a positive light a lot of the times. Not all the time, but a lot of the times. So when you read the two accounts, you get a whole different picture of the Pharisees, and that's because they're writing for a different audience. So how do these events fit together? And I've put up a little thing on the screen here. It's an order of events. We're just going to go through it kind of in a basic way. The story starts. The story starts in Nazareth. It doesn't start in Bethlehem. It starts in Nazareth. Joseph was a man who lived in Nazareth. And he got engaged to Mary while they were at in Nazareth. And that's where he's from. But Matthew doesn't say a lot of different things. Matthew skips over that they were from Nazareth until later on in the story. And it never says what God said to Mary, and it also doesn't talk about any of the signs and wonders that happened the night of Jesus' birth. So that's where the story starts. And then the angel actually goes to Elizabeth first and then Mary. And so while Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant, Mary decides to visit her right after the angel comes to her. Okay, so they're still in Nazareth. She just goes on a trip and comes back. Now we have, after this, that they were in Bethlehem. This Matthew completely skips over. Luke mentions it, Matthew doesn't. And it starts off in chapter 2, we just read it. They leave and go to Bethlehem for a census. They stay there for at least 40 days. We know that because of this. Hold on, let me read it to you. The Jews had certain customs. If you had a son that was born, he had to be circumcised on a certain day, and then he had to be proclaimed on the 40th day. So I believe the circumcision was on the 7th day, unless it was a Sabbath and there was the 8th day. I believe. Don't quote me on. I might be wrong on that. It might just be the 8th day. And then on the 40th day was when the child was proclaimed. And what that meant is you went to the temple again after just being there a couple weeks ago, and you basically declare the child. You say what their name is, and they're welcomed into the Jewish community. For the Jews, the synagogue was not just where you had services, it was where you had life. They would educate people at the synagogue. They would do their baby things at the synagogue. I mean, everything was at the synagogue. It was the center of their life. So you would go there on the 40th day to be proclaimed under your name. So this is where they would have announced that they had a boy and his name was Jesus. So let's see. If you hop in chapter 2, you go down to verse 21. When the 8 days were completed for his circumcision, so here it says 8 days. So either it's including the Sabbath, which would have made it 8th day, or I'm just miscounted, and it's always the 8th day. Because I thought it was on the 7th day. I don't know, whatever. He was named Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived. And when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses were finished, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. 2 different events. Not one, 2 different events. They went up for the circumcision, then they went up for the purification. Okay. Just as it is written in the law of the Lord, and he explains it there. So this second trip up is when all the different signs happen, where Simeon prophesies and Anna the prophetess gives her testimony, all that. That's when all that happens, on the 40th day. When do the shepherds come into play? The shepherds come into play the night of Jesus' birth. which is explained in chapter 2, verse 8. In the same region, shepherds were staying out in the fields and keeping watch at night over their flock. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid, for look, I proclaim to you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today in the city of David a Savior was born for you." Today, this is the same day. So this is where the shepherds come in. I don't know exactly how long the labor was, but evidently they were told about it at night. So I don't know if she finished at night or if God gave Mary some time to decompress after the labor. I don't know. Either way, it was the same day. So then we get to the 40th day, and then after the 40th day, they go back to Nazareth. This is only mentioned in Luke. So you go down to, I think it's towards the end of the chapter. Let me check. Oh, no, it's in verse 39. When they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, and Anna has done her thing, and Simeon has done his thing, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The boy grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was on him. And that's the end. That's the end of Jesus until he's 12 years old. Matthew doesn't even do that. He hops straight from him being a 2-year-old, almost getting murdered by King Herod, and then goes all the way down to when he's an adult and John's on the scene. So you have a lot of skips in the story. Okay, they go back to Nazareth. Now, for some unspecified reason, maybe it was for the Passover, who knows, they end up going back to Bethlehem, but keep in mind that his family is there, so maybe they just went there to visit family, who knows. It has been postulated by some that at this point they had moved to Bethlehem. That's possible too, especially keep in mind that now in the Nazareth community, Mary is going to be looked down on because she had a child, quote-unquote, out of wedlock. Even though Joseph married her before they actually had the baby, it's speculated that she was fooling around. So this is going to look very poorly on Mary, so they would have possibly moved just to get away from the odor of it. That's possible. However, it's kind of vague on this, so I'm not going to say that is what happened. It's just a possibility. Either way, 1 to 2 years later, they're back in Bethlehem, and this is where the Magi come to Jesus and give him the gifts. So they had good reasons for not giving him the diapers, okay? They did. It's because he wasn't hopefully in diapers anymore. I hope, for Mary's sake. Okay. You got in chapter 2, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born of the Jews?" Now look at this, okay? Herod goes and talks to them, and this is what he says. So he assembled all the chief priests, this is in verse 4, and scribes of all of the people, and asked them where the Christ would be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because this was what was written. So then in verse 7, it goes on to say, then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. Now you hop on down, and he says this. And the angel tells the Magi, don't go back and tell Herod he's crazy. And so then this is what happens instead. In verse, we'll pick it up in verse 16. Then Herod, when he realized that he had been outwitted by the wise men, flew into a rage. He gave orders to massacre all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, because the Magi had told him when Jesus had been born. So he was able to deduce that Jesus was somewhere around 1 to 2 years old. So, to cover all of his bases, he had all the kids 2 years and under murdered. So then we get to, let's see, what else? They came back to okay, I already said that. Something that's important to note, which goes back to the whole thing about there being no inn, is if when the Magi come to Jesus, this is what they say. Verse 10. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. They're at the house. It says very clearly they were at a house. There's no reason to assume that this is a different house from the one in Luke 2 years ago. There's no reason to assume that. In fact, given the culture and the history, it's more reasonable to assume it's the exact same house because people didn't move around a whole lot like they do now. If this was your family home, buddy, that was it. Like that's where it is. Nowadays, I think that they say in America, people typically travel, do a major move. I believe it's every 8 years or 5 years or something like that. Well, that's not how the ancient world worked at all. So anyways, and it probably would have been weird for Joseph and Mary to have ran off to Egypt. They've probably got some raised eyebrows about that too. Those weirdos, man. First they have a child out of wedlock, and now they're going off to Egypt. I mean, these are the kinds of things you can imagine them saying. So anyways, they're in Bethlehem again. Once again, it's unclear as whether they live there or not now, but either way, they're there. And so then the Magi go a different way home because they don't want to clue Herod off and get Jesus killed. And so that night, this is what it says. After they were gone, after the Magi were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, get up, take the child as a mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child as a mother during the night, and escaped to Egypt. Now, there are some stories you're going to hear about how Jesus, sometime in his youth, went off to Rome. There is zero historical evidence to back that up. Zero. I know that, there's a whole tradition associated with it, and there's some stories and stuff. Nothing solid, okay? So is it possible that Jesus went off to Rome? Yes, but once again, my interest is in history, not in fantasy. So I'm telling you what is absolute for certain, and there's no solid evidence to say that Jesus went to Rome as a child. So they flee to Egypt for another 2 years, is what Matthew tells us. And then after that, they decide to go back because Herod has died. And this is what it says in verse 19. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, because those who intended to kill the child are dead. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and entered the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. So he doesn't go back to Bethlehem or Judea or any of that area. Okay? And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the region of Galilee instead. Then he went and settled in a town called Nazareth. See, this is the first time Matthew has told us about Nazareth. It does not mention in Matthew that they were from Nazareth at the beginning of the story. So they go back to Nazareth, deciding Bethlehem was a little too iffy, or the area. It doesn't specifically say Bethlehem, it just says the region of Judea. But once again, if they did move to Bethlehem because of Mary's reputation, it would make sense that they were going to go back. But once again, that's kind of just filling in the blanks. So then we are left with Jesus being 4 years old and going to Nazareth. Okay? So what happens next? We don't know. There's a big blank until he's 12 and they go back to Jerusalem and he goes into the temple and he's talking with a Pharisee, or with the teachers of the law, but still Pharisees. And so then that's all we see until he's, an adult. And while Jesus was still living in Nazareth, John began baptizing him, and that's where the part of the issue arises. The two issues that a lot of people keep bringing up during Jesus' ministry. Nothing good ever comes from Nazareth. That's the first thing. The second thing is it sounds like Jesus is an illegitimate child. And so these two things keep coming up in the conversation over and over and over again. And if you read through the Gospels, being sensitive to that, I'm sure you'll be able to notice that for yourself. So anyways, let's see. The last thing that I want to mention about this is just how crazy that is, okay? So no one gospel gives the full birth account. No single one gospel gives the full birth account. Think about this. So the whole shepherds, Gloria in excelsis Deo, remember that song? It's from one account in one gospel. Crazy. Because nowadays, we give a lot of focus on the birth, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what I am saying is that all four of the accounts tell about his death and resurrection. Obviously, the early church and the biblical writers had a very important perspective and had a focus that they wanted to get across. and it wasn't about Jesus being born. It was about his death and resurrection. When all four people are drawing attention to the exact same thing, but this guy only mentions this in passing, and this one mentions that one a little more lengthy, but still, you have to wonder, it might just not be as important as the end of the story, the part where he dies and is resurrected. I mean, that seems like it's the main umph of the story. But, anyways, so I think that we would do well in the Christmas season to always remember the bigger perspective. I mean, yes, Christmas is important. You celebrate it in whichever way seems best to you. But remember that it's not just about the birth. It's what the birth meant, what the birth signified, what the birth led to. And that is infinitely, is of infinite worth. So next week we'll finish talking about the unforgivable sin. But before we close off in prayer, were there any questions? Danny? So we have zero attaching Jesus' birth to December until once again after 200 AD. So that's 200 years after he was here was the first time somebody tried to attach Jesus to the Yuletide. Okay, but as far as we can tell, if you do the math and tradition and all these different things, take them all into account, it seems like he was probably born sometime around April or so. Yeah. He probably was not born on the 25th. Yeah. That's what I was mentioning. The shepherds are told about it at night. But we don't know if they were told about it while she was finishing labor, had just finished labor, or if she had done it earlier in the day and God gave her like some rest time to catch her breath. When Gracie had a child, she wasn't like, okay, let's get up and get back to work. Like, she took a little bit of a power nap. She was conked out. I don't know. It's possible that God was like, let's give Mary a little bit of a nap here before I go get the shepherds involved. But we don't really know. I mean, it doesn't really say. It just says that they were there in Bethlehem, and then the time came for her to give birth. And then at night of that same day, the shepherds were told. So that's all that we know. So we don't really know what time of day. Does that answer that? Okay. Any other questions? We're good? Okay. So, just to be clear, if you want to keep your nativity, that's totally fine. I'm not judging you at all. Like, you do whatever. Just keep in mind that dude's not there. Oh, and by the way, there's never any names given for the three wise men. By the way. Okay? You have all these names and stuff. There's never any names given for the three wise men, okay? So, yeah, there's that. Yep. Okay. We're done? We're good? Okay. All right. Okay. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for this wonderful time of the year when we just get to stop for a second and just remember your grace, your overwhelming love, and the fact that you love the world so much that you gave when we didn't earn it and we didn't even ask for it. We were stuck in our sins and we didn't even want to get better. But Lord, you saw and you intervened. And we thank you for this wonderful time of the year when we all gather together and remember that we would not be here without you, God. And Lord, I pray you'd bless each and every one for the new year. Let their new year be blessed. Let it be filled with you. And Lord, that you would take them to the next level in their faith. And we love you, Lord. Amen. Oh, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, you filthy animals.